Hi, this is Dan Marek, Ruby's Director of Plant-Based Culinary and Development. Welcome to our Ask Me Anything, or office hours. We'll be asking all kinds of different questions on here, and feel free to add more. You can actually do that just by typing in the window on the top right. You can just add your question to it, and then hit the add button underneath it. And then if you want to upvote other people's questions, you can actually just hit the little heart icon next to them on the right-hand side. So let's get started. My first question is from Irene. Hello, Chef Dan. What is the best vegetable to eat raw and why for plant-based eating enhancement? Well, that's a little bit of a difficult question because there are all kinds of vegetables that I like to eat raw. And I like to have a big variety of them at the same time. So I would definitely choose a lot of different vegetables. I usually try to keep with the rule of eating a rainbow as well, so you can eat a lot of different colors because you get a lot of different nutrients and micronutrients from those vegetables at the same time. Now for raw things, for like snacking, I have two toddlers, so the little baby carrots are a very common thing in our house as well. Same with things like celery and things like that as well too. Depending on the seasonality, that's really when I kind of switch on what I'm going to be eating raw because the things that are in season are going to taste better. My favorite example of that is actually a tomato. If you have a tomato in the middle of, say, September, it's going to have all that full, great flavor to it. But if you're having one in December, unless it's grown indoors, it's typically not going to have a great flavor to it because the tomatoes have a much longer voyage for them, So to get here in Austin, Texas, a tomato might get in a truck from very southern Mexico. It takes 7 to 10 days to get here. That means that entire journey, it's actually losing its flavor because it's starting to decompose, right? So you're losing the flavor and the vitamins at the same time. So my tips for eating things or eating vegetables in their raw form to be able to get most flavor enhancement is to be able to eat them in season and pick the things that you like. All right, hope that helps. All right, so the next one is from Tori. I'd love to know more about the foundation of menu building. I'm aspiring to turn my cooking passion into a cafe to serve my hometown folks vegan plates that they do not have access to eating it while eating out. This is great. I love this for the foundation of menu building. If you're building a cafe, it's a little bit different because you also have to take into consideration what ingredients you're using. So the foundation of menu building is just kind of looking to see what kind of things pair well together. So if you're going to have a cafe that features, let's just say sandwiches, right? So the sandwiches, you want to have sides that actually complement some of those dishes really well, but that will also complement other sandwiches on your recipe very well. So you might have, just like a chickpea chicken salad or the style that we do the tuna salad as well using chickpeas. You want something that'll complement those flavors in there. So maybe something like a little cucumber and tomato and onion salad on the side, but you could also do a pasta salad on the side that would kind of be able to do different things on those. Now, the reason I say if you're talking about costs and ingredients, you'll also want to pay attention to things that you can use multiple times in that cafe, right? So you don't want to buy an ingredient that's only going to be on one menu item. So if you only have one sandwich that has tomatoes on it, you might want to consider either putting it on more tomatoes or taking tomatoes off of your menu, just because you want items that you can use in a wide variety of things that are on your menu to be able to keep your costs and production down. So I hope that helps. That's a great question. And happy eating. That sounds like a fun thing to be able to start up in your hometown. All right, so next we'll move on to Beverly K. What vegetable trimmings can be put in the freezer to eventually use for making vegetable stock, and how should they be stored in the freezer to prevent freezer burn? Can they be completely raw, or do they need blanching? That's a great question, Beverly. That's actually something I do weekly. Every time I cut up things, I put the scraps into just a large, resealable bag and put them into it. I make sure that there's a double seal on it too, and sometimes if that bag's a little old, I might put it inside of another one just to make sure I'm not getting any freezer burn on it. I put them in there actually completely raw too. So I kind of stick to certain things, usually the onion skins and ends I'll put in there consistently, the insides of peppers, and typically like, the cores of the peppers as well. Carrot ends and carrot sticks, or carrot peelings, because like I said, my toddlers eat carrots a lot, so peel a lot of carrots, so I'm putting those in there. And that's kind of my basic mirepoix that I'm going to use for my stock. Now, things you don't want to put into your stock are things that are very herbaceous, so you're not going to put garlic into your stock, or you're not going to put certain herbs, that might be just a little overpowering. So like fennel or something like that, it would just kind of overpower the flavor of the stock. But that being said, you could also go to a very specific kind of a stock, So one thing I would say not to put into a stock is beets, right? Because it completely colors and changes the complete flavor profile of the stock if you used beets. But if you're going to make a borscht, it's actually okay because beet being the main ingredient in that could work really well. I also like using mushrooms in my stocks too, but I'll typically go with a dried mushroom. Depending on if I have any trimmings, from the bottoms of shiitakes are probably the one thing that I use primarily, in those stocks. So I'll take the stems and put those into that baggie, or the bottom of some oyster mushrooms. When they come in the big clumps, you can cut the clump off the bottom, and I'll use that for stocks as well. So those I basically put in this large baggie and put them into my freezer until that baggie starts to fill up, and then I'll put it into a big pot, top it off with water, bring to boil, then down to a simmer for about an hour and a half. I do it, and it starts reducing down, and then you take all the excess out basically and compost it. And then I have a great rich stock. It's usually, about 4 quarts or so that I'll make every week, maybe week and a half, depending on what's going on in the kitchen. But that's the way I do it, and I definitely recommend it. You don't need to blanch things beforehand as well. Just raw is totally okay, and try to keep it kind of simple and not go off into big flavor profiles for a simple stock. I hope that helps, Beverly. Davian, is there any real reason to get an air fryer, or is it junk cooking? Junk cooking like a crock pot? So air fryers. I actually just got one in the last 4 months, and I'm surprised how much I use it. I've never been a big deep fryer kind of person, and still am not, but I do like that it will do things like cook egg rolls in 8 minutes, which is fantastic. I basically bought one that replaced my toaster oven. My toaster oven was getting kind of out of sorts, so I wanted one that would kind of work in replacement as a toaster oven, so I don't have to turn on my large oven when I'm doing small little things. Because in Austin it gets hot and you don't want to use your oven very often. So having a tabletop thing like this worked great. And the air fryer cooks in a different way. It's kind of like a convection, where the air kind of keeps going around inside of it and it's moving around a lot more. So it heats pretty evenly. It's great for roasting and things like that too. So I don't do, a lot of frying per se in it, but I will do things like tofu in it, and I'll do like cauliflower, kind of bites, kind of like a buffalo cauliflower. And it works for great things like that. Could you do that in your oven as well? Yes, you totally could. But the air fryer just seems to work a little bit better. And I think it's partly because it has like a basket with air kind of circulating around every surface of the vegetables, which works great. So, you know, um, I think it works great. I own a crock pot as well, but I can't remember the last time I've used it. A lot of people like them because you can just set it and leave, which is a wonderful thing. And it really depends, on your style of cooking and what works great for you. But so, yeah, the air fryer, I do like them, but I also use it just as often as to make toast in the morning or something like that. Just getting a dual purpose instrument. Hope that helps, David. Marilyn, cutting boards, wood, bamboo, plastic, which is the best and for what? Pardon me, I don't use plastic. My bamboo is cracking and wood is heavy. Um, yeah, so I do a combination of them. I typically use mostly wood cutting boards, but I also have some plastic ones. Plastic is most often used for people that are using or preparing meats as well, because you don't want some of the bacteria coming off of some like chicken, that can actually seep into your cutting board, and you don't want that. So plastic is actually much better to be able to do that, and much easier to be able to clean and sterilize. So, I do have plastic ones, but I don't use them with meat at all because I've been plant-based for so long. What I do use them for, certain things will stain, so my plastic cutting boards are all red actually, because if I'm cutting things like strawberries or beets on them, like if I were to do that on a wood cutting board, that would actually never come out of my cutting board, the wood ones. So I'll use the plastic cutting boards for something like that. My two girls in the morning eat strawberries every single morning, so that's something that's works really well for me. Just have a small red cutting board and a paring knife to be able to cut those down. Now, the wood ones are heavier, but I just like them a lot better. You can get thinner ones and they'll make them not as heavy as well. They're not dishwasher safe, so you can't put a wood cutting board into your dishwasher, where the plastic one you could, to be able to help sterilize it. I just like the feel of the wood ones a little bit more, but common practice in most restaurants, you're going to find plastic ones as well, just because they're so easy to sterilize. On either of these, if you start getting kind of deep gouges into your cutting board over time, which will happen, it's time to replace those cutting boards as well too. The bamboo, I've had like, I think one of those, and it didn't last as long as I'd like it to. So I actually haven't gotten another one, but I have so many wood and plastic ones, I haven't needed to. So I hope that helps a little bit. The plastic is great to be able to sterilize really easy, and the wood ones, I just like the feel of it. It also looks really nice if you're presenting on a cutting board as well too. All right, so Megan, what sort of qualifications does one need to work as a in-home chef? You actually don't need a whole lot of qualifications to be a personal in-home chef. The biggest thing I would recommend is, if you've gone through some of these classes, that's great. If somebody's wanting to hire you because of your skills, that's great. So just getting hired is kind of the first step in that. But if you have not been hired as an in-home chef, you need to really kind of show off some of your skills. So are you a graduate of Ruby? Do you have your Crudley badge to be able to show that you graduated one of the classes? So you might have to do kind of a little bit of a marketing pitch to whoever you're pitching to be an in-house chef as well too. So being able to show off some of the menu items you can do, the executions, what some of your menu planning might be for a week as well. And really kind of seeking out different ways to be able to impress the people you're working for. Now, there are also a lot of business things that come along with that as well too. And an in-home chef, you don't have to worry about certain things like permitting and stuff like that, but you do want to make sure that your sanitation is up to par as well, and kind of find out scheduling wise. I've been offered many personal chef gigs, and some of those are, I'm going to ring a bell at any time of the day and you need to make me food. And you need to be up for that, so if it's 2 in the morning and somebody wants some sort of dessert or something like that made, that is something that's pretty common in the in-home chef categories, is being able to kind of be on call whenever needed. So qualifications, you don't need a whole lot of. What you do need is a little bit of a business plan for yourself, and a good repertoire of recipes that you can use and be able to share with your client, so they can kind of pick through things to be able to do. Because, especially like if you're plant-based, you don't want them saying, oh, I want, a roast of lamb or rack of lamb or something like that, because that's not something that is in your wheelhouse to be able to do. So kind of creating a menu list is probably a good place to be able to start with that. I hope that helps a little bit, Megan. All right, so Joe, make foods crispy with no oil or butter. So yeah, you can actually do that. It's actually, not always the oil or the butter that do that. Now, a lot of times people use like a spray or butter to be able to do that. What they're doing is just adding the fat, so it'll crisp up on the edge as well. I use that air fryer to kind of crisp up my tofu all the time as well, but I also do that in the oven. And I'll just basically do that by marinating my tofu ahead of time, like we kind of show a pressed tofu in our classes. And I'll press that tofu and then put it in the oven, flat down with nothing else, and no oil in the marinade typically. And I'll do it at 350 for about 20 minutes, and then I'll get a metal spatula and scrape it off the bottom of the pan, and then flip it over and do it for another 20 minutes to be able to make it get nice and crispy. And that's with no kind of batter or anything on it, but if you did do a batter, you'd actually get that same kind of thing out of it. So I did a recipe this weekend where it was a sesame tofu, and it was basically you soaked the tofu in an almond milk, and then you battered it with gluten-free breadcrumbs. on the outside of that and then baked it off that way, and that had the same kind of effect. It was definitely different because of the um, the gluten-free breadcrumbs on it, but that's what actually gave it the crunch. And then I made a sauce for it and then tossed it in that sauce and baked it again, and it still retained that crunch afterwards. So that's a different way and a unique way to be able to do it. But just cooking it properly in that way to be able to get that edge and kind of get a little caramelized edge on it, I think is probably the best way to be able to make that happen. And you don't need no oil or butter, or you don't need any oil or butter to be able to make that happen. All right. So Kathleen, what are the reasons for choosing dried mushrooms in a recipe rather than fresh? Do dried mushrooms need to be washed? I worry that there's dirt in them, so I'm reluctant to use them. So yeah, you don't typically need to wash dried mushrooms because they're washed prior to drying. So they're getting all the dirt particles off of the mushrooms before they're drying them out. Just for that same reason, it's going to be really hard to be able to wash a dried mushroom. Now, using them dried versus fresh depends on the recipe completely, so if you're going to be doing like a mushroom gravy, you might use both. You might want to have the texture of that fresh mushroom and then also have the big umami burst that a dried mushroom does, because by far and away dried mushrooms will give you that umami flavor bigger and better than most fresh mushrooms. They're also better to be able to store and keep. I typically use dried mushrooms a couple times a week, and I'll also make a dried mushroom powder too to be able to add things too. So what a dried mushroom powder is just a variety of different dried mushrooms. You put them into your blender and turn them into a powder, and then you can use them as a spice to be able to add things to when you want to get a burst of umami flavor. Now, those typically, just like any dried herb, you want to have them cook in some sort of liquid or sauce or something for a little bit to be able to immerse that flavor into. Now, the fresh mushrooms, again, it's great, and it's a different mouthfeel on those fresh mushrooms. So, most of the time I'm going to go with a fresh mushroom, but there are certain things every single time I'm always going to go with a dried mushroom, like making a dashi, like a stock, like a mushroom stock. I typically am going to go with a dried mushroom. Same with things like a ramen broth. I'm most likely always going to use a dried shiitake in that, or whatever dried mushrooms I have on hand. But I just know that that's going to give the umami flavor that I'm really looking for, and it's going to be very potent. Now, if I were to make that same dashi with a fresh shiitake mushroom, it's going to take a little bit more of those mushrooms to make that happen, or a little bit of cooking beforehand to be able to help release some of that flavor. So definitely use the dried mushrooms openly. I think it's something great to be able to utilize. And adding them with fresh mushrooms, you're actually going to get a really big pop of that umami flavor if that's what you're looking for. So I hope that helps, Kathleen. Carol Ann. Hello, Chef Dan. Thank you for this Q&A. I couldn't help notice, but Dr. Michael Greger's book in the background, How Not to Die, a really great read. What other authors do you follow and recommend? Wow, Carol Ann. I read a lot. This is just a very small section of my library, which you can't see off in the corner, is a huge, 4-foot stack of cookbooks and things in the back as well, too. Dr. Michael Greger and I have a long time relationship. I basically started getting into plant-based whole foods diets very early, about 15 years ago, actually. And first started working with the Esselsteins and Dr. Furman, McDougall, McGregor, Dr. Neil Medard is another one that's a great, physician, but, and the China study too. So Colin Campbell, all of these are kind of the starters in this movement, I think, that we're seeing come to full fruition now. And those are probably some of the biggest people that I would recommend reading, especially if you're going for a whole food plant-based diet. I am also, as you can see, very interested in all kinds of cooking styles too. So it's only been in the past, say, 5 to 6 years that we're actually getting great books on, diverse recipes from, across the world. Like you can see, I think right above my head here, I have the Korean vegan cookbook, which is wonderful. Seeing cookbooks like that are, stretching over other cultures in vegan food, I think is wonderful. And I think the diversity of those cookbooks now is just something that I am super excited about. So beyond the medical books, if you will, I really encourage going into cookbooks and reviewing what you can out of those and taking pieces of those and practicing recipes that you can, make your own and really get great flavors out of. So the doctor books, wonderful, and love the How Not to Die book. I think that's a great one too. And Neil Bernard's books, like the book that actually turned me into a vegetarian at first 25 years ago was the was Robbins. I can't remember the name of the book now. Has America in the title, but it'll come back to me later. But Robbins is one of those. He actually was a you know, he inherited Baskin Robbins, basically. His father had run Baskin Robbins, and his father had died basically from cardiovascular disease, what they pretty much attributed to. I pretty much attributed that to all the ice cream he ate. So he wanted to be able to look right. It's Diet for a New America by Tom Robbins is the name of that book. And I can see that Richard has added the links for How Not to Die and The Korean Vegan, which is one of those books I can't recommend enough. But yeah, so I think, those are probably, I know I kind of named a lot of names in there, but those are some of the leaders in the industry in whole food plant-based diet, health, but then also just exploring cookbooks across the gamut and really seeing what's out there is wonderful. If you can get your hands on a physical copy, at a bookstore is great. Right now, I know that's a little bit harder, but even on Amazon, they'll let you do some previews of things, and just keep maybe close attention to what's going on in the International Culinary Association, cookbook awards or the James Beard Cookbook Awards. There are a lot of different ones to be able to look in those. And it's okay if they're not all 100% vegan cookbooks or plant-based cookbooks, because you can still get inspired by recipes that aren't plant-based and use techniques in those. You might not be making some of those. Like I have a lot of Jacques Pepin books because I worked with them to be able to build a class. And I'm not going to make an egg in aspic anytime soon, but it's cool to be able to know about the technique and how it works. And then also see if there's something we can actually do on, in a vegan way, maybe using agar-agar or something like that. So a lot of cool things, a lot of great books. And thank you, Richard, for putting in some of the links in there as well. Okay, so Mike, what's a good way to season mashed potatoes without a bunch of fat added? That's actually a great question. I just recently made a Valentine's dinner where I did like a pressed mushroom, and did like a side of asparagus and a baked potato. And I haven't done a baked potato in a long time, actually. And one of the things I actually loved about, I changed the technique a little bit, where I used to like wrap them in foil and stuff like that. But I just roasted it in the oven basically and kept turning it, and crisped out the edge of it and just made the inside really nice and fluffy. And what I did with that was just a little bit of salt and pepper, and then got fresh chives and chopped those up really fine, and then used a fork on the inside to kind of fluff out the potato on the inside. And then using that seasoning just changed it quite a bit on those. Now, just the chives, salt, and pepper were a wonderful way to go. Now, most people would add butter, even if it's vegan butter, to that. But you can also switch that up a little bit without using all that fat, by using the herbs, if you will. So chopping up some dill would be a wonderful thing to add in there to actually give a nice bright texture to it as well. We could also put in some curly parsley or flat leaf parsley in there to be able to add a little bit of pop to the flavor too. But experimenting with a little bit. If you're going with the mashed potatoes, you can switch it up in a variety of different textures and do things that are surprising. It doesn't always have to be the kind of traditional avenue for a mashed potato. Maybe do something, completely out of the ordinary, or maybe adding like a curry mix to it or something would be a very different way to be able to look at that. But just seasoning with salt and the pepper and chives, I probably think is the most traditional that I typically do a lot. But you don't have to add all the fat to that as well, or just do a much smaller amount of fat that you're adding to it as well. I hope that helps, Mike. All right, Valentina. Hi, Dan. Is homemade soy yogurt gone fizzy no longer safe to eat? The last time I made soy yogurt, I noticed it had turned fizzy, so I discarded it. I wasn't sure. I generally add a bit of agar powder to thicken it, and I just lost it, to thicken it, and it's usually fine. Yep. That's actually the fizziness is that's actually kind of a normal thing, depending. I mean, if it's super fizzy, that's interesting. But I think what's happening is that your yogurt's starting to re-ferment, right? So the bubbles and the fizziness that are coming out of those are from the fermentation process. So it might be that you're keeping your soy yogurt at a warmer temperature. I would definitely recommend putting it in the fridge to be able to, stop that process a little bit, because you don't want to get too fizzy, because then it just kind of tastes weird mouthfeel, like just texture wise, it's a little odd. It's something that's normal in the process. If it smells bad though, definitely don't eat it. It should smell just the way you made it. It's going to have a little kind of bitterness to it, and those little air pockets and the bubbles that are forming from the fermentation are going to give it the unique flavor that it's added from that as well. So yeah, it should have a little bit of fizz to it if you left it out and it's fermenting again. But that's something that happens in all kinds of yogurts as well. It's just your probiotic activating again, which will happen. And the agar powder to it to thicken it totally works, for that as well too. So I hope that helps. Thanks, Valentina. Kelly, all right. Is there a lot of overlap between Forks Over Knives, Whole Food Plant-Based Cooking course, and the Ruby Plant-Based course? I'm in the Forks Over Knives course now, trying to decide if it makes sense to take both. I actually just personally revamped the Plant-Based Pro course with a team of Ruby experts, and have a very wide knowledge of it. And there are some things that overlap with Forks Over Knives, but by and large, a lot of it doesn't. Plant-Based Pro is catered more towards the professional, and the Forks Over Knives is catered specifically towards Forks Over Knives advocates, the very whole food plant-based cooking, where Plants Pro is not a whole food plant-based. The majority, like 98% of it probably, I would say, could be converted to no oil plant-based diet, but with a little bit of help or knowledge to be able to do that as well. You can just ask the instructors for that. But the plant-based pro class is really, kind of taking it that next level, instead of just thinking about what am I going to put on my plate for the evening. Plant-Based Pro kind of opens up the options for you, and we cover other things that aren't in forks, like meat alternatives, how to make, do fermentations, how to do, like the yogurt she was talking about. We do a couple different ones. We do a soy-based yogurt, we do a coconut yogurt, we do a kombucha, do quick pickles on onions and stuff like that, like all kinds of different things in the fermentation. But then we also do things like the alternatives, right? So we show you how to make a plant-based butter, but that plant-based butter is an oil product, so it wouldn't be something that we find in the Forks Over Knives. We show you how to make seitan, but we'll also do a gluten-free version of that seitan too, to be able to, really, we try to make that class so anybody who has gluten intolerances has an alternative to be able to make as well. And we cover a lot more world flavors in the Plant-Based Pro than Forks Over Knives does too. So yeah, there's a pretty big difference for it, and we do see a lot of Forks Over Knives graduates take the Plant-Based Pro course, because it really does seem to be that next evolution of the course. So if you're interested in it, I would highly recommend it as a Forks Over Knives graduate. Just remember that caveat that it's not, a whole food plant-based course, it's a plant-based course. So some of those recipes, you'll just have to, if it says to saute in oil, well, you know how to saute just using water, so you can make that change a little bit too. If there's something that's just blaringly, like, okay, this can't be done like the butter, well, we're not actually quizzing people on the butter aspect, so you can choose a different lesson or something to be able to work on if you need to. I hope that helps out, Kelly. Gina, organic or not? Should certain foods I buy be organic? I never know what's the best in trying to budget for this plant-based lifestyle. Yeah, that's a very common question. And, I used to work in the grocery industry for Whole Foods, which kind of helped put the word organic on the map. And even then, when I had a discount at a grocery store, I wouldn't buy 100% organic. Now, here's what I always tell people, and I used to do demonstrations for grocery stores all the time too. I always buy organic when I know it's something that I can't wash very well, right? So If I had something like a banana, right? Well, that banana, if it was sitting in the tree, well, the pesticides are getting just sprayed right onto that banana. And when I take that banana down off the tree, I can peel the outside of that banana off. And, most of the pesticides are going to come off with that peel. Now, there are some pesticides that grow down through the roots and up into the tree as well, but for the majority, I've gotten most of those pesticides, direct pesticides off the outside of that. Now, what might change a little bit in that is something like broccoli, right? Or raspberries. There are all these little tiny cracks in between all of those little pieces of broccoli or the raspberry. And I know no matter how much I wash the outside of them, I'm not going to be able to get all the pesticides off the direct outside of that. So things like raspberries or broccoli, I buy 100% organic all the time just to make it a little bit easier for myself and know that I'm not going to have to worry about all those pesticides getting in directly to my mouth as well too. Something like a red pepper, right? I might buy a red pepper that's just conventional instead of organic because I can know it has such a smooth surface and there's not a lot of crevices in it that I can wash the outside of that off really well to be able to get any of the pesticides off of that. So there is a balance between them, and everybody has their own balance for them. But to be able to make sure that you can afford to be able to eat a whole food plant-based diet, you definitely have to think about little things like that to be able to make it more affordable for yourself. It'd be great if we all ate 100% organic, but that's typically not a possibility because organic items typically cost about 20% more than their conventional versions. So thinking about that and how can I wash the pesticides off of this is probably the biggest thing I want to do. And then also just knowing that organic in some instances protects you from other things. Like a lot of people don't realize that most sugar is actually clarified or bleached out using animal bone from slaughterhouses. But if you buy an organic sugar, that's actually not allowed. So it's an easy way to be able to distinguish if you're buying an organic sugar versus a conventional sugar, or if you're buying a vegan sugar versus a non-vegan sugar, is just to buy the organic version of it. There's a lot more I could talk on that, but I'll leave it at that at the moment. So thanks for your question, Gina. David, what are your recommendations on next steps for after we finish this course, especially for beginners? I don't know what course you're in, David, but if I'm guessing you're in Forks Over Knives if you're in the beginners kind of area. So I think the biggest thing to do with this is, a lot of our students don't do this enough, is once you've finished your class, go through it again and look at the things you might have missed. Did you go through every recipe? It's kind of like, I talk with my father-in-law about this, like what type of person in a museum are you, right? Are you the type of person where you look at every single placard and look at every single piece of art and appreciate it at the moment for as long as you can? Will it take you a day to go through a museum, or will it take you an hour to go through a museum? So that kind of applies with our courses as well. A lot of people will pick and choose where they want to go through the course, but they might miss something. After you're done with the course, you have the opportunity to be able to go back and use anything from that course again. So I really recommend that people go back and look at different recipes and try them, because if you haven't tried them again, it's actually a wonderful way to be able to, kind of move to that next step and make sure you've absorbed all the information from those as well. Try practicing different recipes, and then also go through the live events like the one that we're doing right now. You can go through all of the live events that have been recorded and learn a lot of great things in there. In fact, Dr. Michael Greger was one of the guests on one of our live events. And it's a great person. Dr. Scott Stoll is another person I can think of right away too, to be able to look at those. So go through the live events and then re-inspect the class as well. If you feel like you're not getting enough, it might be time to register for another class. For the natural evolution, I think from Forks Over Knives at the moment is probably Plant-Based Pro. It's a great course to be able to go into. And we do take credit for, if you've already done things like the chickpea tuna salad, if you've done it in one course, you don't have to do it in the other one. You can present your materials on that as well. You just need to give us a heads up that you've done it before, so we're not thinking that you're getting the material from somewhere else. But yeah, so that's the big thing, is go back, review over some of the material, and get in the kitchen. All right, so Marcy, what are some of your favorite ingredients, sauces, and condiments to keep on hand that build depth of flavor in plant-based dishes? Wow, if you could see my fridge and all the sauces that I have constantly, it's a wide variety of them. So ingredients and sauces and condiments. So let's see. In the soy category, there are a lot for me. So I'll do like a tamari and a shoyu and a soy sauce are kind of traditional ones, but I'll also have like a Bragg's liquid aminos to be able to not have the soy in it as well. I also do dark soys too, but then I'll do things in completely other, kind of sets as well. So like a pesto is something I like to make quite often, especially in the season when I can get a lot of basil off of my plants as well. Is something I like to have in the kitchen quite often. Um, I'll typically do like brown kind of Asian style sauces too that I'll have in the fridge. I have like a sesame sauce in the fridge right now that I used this weekend. But I'll also go for big for vinegars, so I have a wide variety of vinegars, and you can go beyond like the balsamics or the whites. You can do champagne vinegars, you can do black vinegars, a wide variety of different flavor profiles to make those happen. Then, if you do oils, there's a wide variety of those too. I don't use oil that often, but when I do, I'm going to go for something that's a little unique, like a chili oil, like a Szechuan chili oil or something like that, which is nice because you have these like kind of crispy bits of the Szechuan chilies in the oil, and you can just kind of put it over the top. Sriracha is probably one of those things that I have in my fridge constantly. In fact, just this morning when I was putting some sriracha on my tofu scrambled taco, I realized that I have to make some more. And that's actually something you learn in the plant-based pro class. Is I put in the version of a sriracha. It's a fermented sriracha that I make, and I keep constantly in my refrigerator. My wife and I have it all the time. But yeah, so those are just kind of my main staples that I have all the time. And I make other things too. Like my kids, I think like every other kid likes ranch dressing, but they're not going to eat, the full dairy one they'd get at Costco or something like that. I'll typically make it doing, a tofu recipe or something like that. So those are kind of main staples that I would keep in my fridge for something like that as well too. And, just making it from dried herbs and stuff like that. So those are probably my main staples, condiments, and sauces. I've listed quite a bit there. And there's a bunch that I'm leaving off as well. I'm just instantly thinking of like 20 more, but that'll take up too much time. So I hope that helps, Marcy. Lisa, how long have you been cooking whole food and plant-based? Well, a long time. I started professionally cooking whole food, plant-based about 16 years ago. And that was really early for this industry. That's literally right when, that's pretty early for it. So like I was working at Whole Foods Market, and they went through this program that was a completely whole food plant-based diet and had all the doctors like I was talking about as their guidance. So it was like Scott Stoll, Furman, Klopper, all these different medical advisory board people. And those are the people I directly learned from to be able to do this. And because I had already been, a vegan vegetarian cook for 10 years before that for my own personal life, I had a lot of experience to be able to come into those conversations with to say like, okay, how can we make this conversion? Some of the biggest things for chefs were the salt and fat, specifically oil. And it was something that I overcame kind of early and started just figuring out ways to be able to do it differently. And a lot of people came to me and were like, how did you come up with this technique of cooking, sauteing in water? And I'd have to say, I'm not the guy who did that. Somebody thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago did that. What's happening is we're just starting to see that start to evolve again now, and people are starting to use those techniques again. So I've been cooking whole food plant-based for a very long time, in this industry, style. But I also don't follow a whole food plant-based diet 100% of the time. I do use oil, for family recipes and things like that as well too. So yeah, I've been cooking professionally in that aspect for about 15 years. Marion, hi Chef Dan, do recipes account for product loss? For example, if I measure 1 tablespoon of agave and pour that in a small mise en place bowl, what ends up in the dish is less than a tablespoon, or some of it will be stuck to the spoon in the bowl. You're absolutely right on that, Marion, and most recipes are considering you putting a full tablespoon of something in there. Now, if it were something like a tablespoon of water, of course, all of that's going to transfer in, but agave might not as much. So you might actually want to go in and scrape a little out with your finger to make sure that it gets in there. or a clean spatula would probably be a better solution for that as well. But you are right, there's going to be a little bit of loss. Is it enough to completely change the recipe? Probably not. But using a small spatula, probably would be a good idea to be able to make sure you're getting all of that out of there. A lot of people, you've probably seen this at a couple of live events that I've done in the past too, whereas like if you're using a tablespoon to put something into like a liquid, like I'll typically take that tablespoon and stir the liquid with the thing in there. So all the stuff comes off the tablespoon to be able to get out that as well. The mise en place that we do for our classes is wonderful, but a lot of times I'll make one mise en place kind of like I'll do a dry batch and kind of a wet batch of things, or depending on when they need to be added in, I'll kind of put them into the same area too, and there's less of the loss on that. But that's a very good point, Marion. Thanks for bringing that up. Julietta, what ingredient do you find yourself substituting more often when you cannot find it at the grocery store? Wow, that's a good question. What do I find myself substituting more often when you can't find it at the grocery store? I don't know if it's a specific ingredient, because I've been doing it long enough where I know how to diversify things, So when I was cooking, 25 years ago as a vegetarian, and I used to be in the music industry, I would literally go on tour with a band and have like an electric wok in the back of it and be able to cook just out of that thing, right? So that style of cooking creates something where you're not going to be getting the same ingredients all the time, and you're really dependent on what you can find at farm stands and grocery stores along the way. So kind of switching things up is kind of a norm for me, and I actually love it. It's actually my favorite game to play. It's like, what are we going to have to dinner? What are we gonna have for dinner tonight if my wife says we don't have any food? And I'm like, well, there's tons of food. We have a lot of ingredients, but no prepared dishes, right? So, as far as substituting wise, you can make a lot of different substitutions to make that happen. So, a good example was last night we made what was it? Calzone for dinner. My wife was great at making calzones, but my youngest daughter doesn't eat some of the things that are traditionally in those. We had like a mushroom and spinach and onion filling for ours, but my youngest daughter wouldn't eat something like that. So I actually did something, a bean instead. So I went to go to my pantry and grab a can of white beans and make a nice kind of filling on the inside that was kind of, Italian flavored with some oregano and garlic into it. But I realized that I didn't have any white beans. All I had were kidney beans. So you end up with like kind of a pink version of that instead, but you're still getting the same flavor profile if you just tweak out the flavors enough on it. So beans might be one of those things that I trade out a bit, but I can't think of anything in particular where I'm like constantly like, I've got to, find a substitution for that, when I'm looking at the grocery store. But yeah, but if you have something specific, Julietta, you can always email me at dan@ruby.com. Andrew, please provide a list of basic kitchen tools and appliances needed or at least helpful for all recipes, all included recipes. So they're typically in the classes that you have an equipment list. At the very beginning of the class, you'll find it typically it's a sidebar within the first 4 to 5 tasks. Deanne in our crew does a great job of doing those, and she literally goes through every single recipe to see if some sort of equipment is needed for a recipe that she'll list it in that. That being said, you're not going to need a whole lot depending on the course you're in. The pro class has a couple more unique items in it, but by and large, if you have a good sharp knife, a cutting board, and a couple things, like a food processor is great to have. A blender is great to have. You don't always need both. Sometimes you can get away with using one or the other. If you're doing like a cashew cream or a bechamel, I definitely recommend having a good high quality blender for those as well. But I mean, beyond that, you're not going to need a whole lot of specialty tools here. A good knife, cutting board, and maybe one of those powered electronics will probably do best for you. Fancier items like, I don't know, like a nut milk maker, like you don't need things like that, or a KitchenAid mixer. Typically not something you would need unless you're doing it a lot more often. But definitely check the equipment list at the beginning of your class to see what you'll need. Barbara, do you have any experience on making vegan cheeses with Rejuvelac? What's your favorite grains to use if you've made it? I actually have never made one of those before with Rejuvelac. But you know what? Shar on our team, I think, has experimented with that. So Shar Nolan is a wonderful instructor for Ruby as well. If you've taken one of our plant-based classes, you've probably had her as one of your graders. I would email Shar, and her email address is just shar@ruby.com. She might have some tips for you on that because that's something I have not experimented with too much. Sorry about that, Barbara, but Shar might have an answer for you. All right, so Sheila, what's the best way to sharpen knives? It seems my knives are always a little too dull. That is, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about. Sharpening knives, having a sharp knife is essential in a kitchen. If you're going to get a professional job in a kitchen, a lot of times the first thing that they'll do is check your knife bag and see how sharp your knives are, because that's one of the first things you need to be able to, those are your kitchen tools. So, keeping your knife sharp is an essential part of working in a kitchen. There are two things I always recommend. The first one is get a good steel. It's a honing steel, basically, and it's kind of a long object. You'll see them in knife blocks. And what that does is when your knife basically is cutting things, it's going to start kind of curving over onto one side a little bit like that. And what the honing tool does is kind of knock that edge off so it flattens out a little bit better like that. So actually have the flat edge instead of starting to curl over. That honing tool comes and knocks it down and puts that back to that edge. Now that's honing though, it's not quite sharpening. You'll want a good stone, a wet stone. Typically they have a grade on each side, something that's finer and something that's rougher. And we actually have guides for our knife skills to how to use a whetstone, and I think that's something everybody should have and know how to use really well. Now, once you sharpen your knives, you can also use an electric sharpener too. But once you sharpen your knives, either using an electric sharpener or a whetstone, then you'll be able to use your honing tool and keep it sharp for a much longer amount of time. But in the meantime, if your blades are sharp right now, you can try the honing tool, but you might want to start just by using a whetstone or the electric sharpener to be able to sharpen those down to get them as sharp as you possibly can and then maintain them that way the longer you have them. Hope that helps. Let's see. So, Katie, substitute for wine recipes if you do not use alcohol at all in your diet. Is cashew bechamel penne carbonara? I think that's two questions. So, substitutes for wine in recipes if you don't use alcohol in your diet. Typically, the first thing I would go towards is a fruit juice. So wine is basically a fermented grape juice. So start there. They have all kinds of other grape juices that aren't like your Welch's, Concord grape. And you'll find them in all kinds of places that, in grocery stores, and they'll be in bottles, and, apple juices that have a kind of a light, flavor to them as well. But what you're looking for is kind of a really light grape juice that doesn't have an overpowering flavor like the Concord. Those are great substitutes for wines and recipes, and you can use them pretty interchangeably once you find the right one for you. Now, there are a lot of different brands out there, and depending where you are in the world, it'll depend, on what kind of flavor profiles you can get. So you might need to experiment with a couple before finding them as well. But yeah, if you're looking for kind of a one-to-one for wine, you can go with a really light juice. And depending on what it is, you might be able to skip the line in that aspect as well too. Now the second part is cashew bechamel penne carbonara. I'm guessing you're asking, is the cashew bechamel the penne carbonara? Which it could be. A bechamel is typically it's like an almond milk with flour kind of mix, and you make a roux basically out of that. It's kind of the bechamel. And for the cashew bechamel, you're using cashews to be able to make that roux as well. Now the penne carbonara is typically an egg, based dish with cheese, and then you add bacon to it. But the vegan versions could be made out of a cashew bechamel at the same kind of a time to be able to get that roux. And you do like shiitake bacon or some other plant-based bacon, or I've seen like some dried tomatoes to get that umami flavor as well. But they could be interchangeable, but they're not always. I make my carbonara very different than using a cashew bechamel, primarily just because one of my daughters had a cashew allergy, so we didn't use cashews for a while. But Well, fortunately, she's out of that, but so we kind of switch it up a little bit. So they definitely are similar in the sauce family, but not exactly the same. All right, so Barbara, hi Chef Dan, I want to make a plant-based broth to drink for breakfast. What are your thoughts on a recipe? I love plant-based broths for breakfast. I would definitely check out some Ayurvedic, recipes for. They're basically kind of simple recipes that can kind of get you going. I'll typically make a dashi, and I might add things to it depending on what I have in the fridge. So my dashi is typically made from my house-made vegetable stock that I save all those scraps, like I talked about from the beginning of this, and I'll have that just in my fridge. Now, in the morning, typically I'll come down and I'll put that stock on the stove, and I'll put in some dried shiitake mushrooms into that, and then maybe some green onions or chives to be able to add to it as well. And then maybe just a couple small cubes of tofu, just something really small, nothing, it's really kind of an easy way to be able to get, the nutrients from all those vegetables into it. But I also like a little bit of substance. So I might put a little bit of tofu or just a couple scoops of brown rice into that as well. So I like that. Just a simple vegetable broth with the dried mushrooms, is a great way to be able to do that. You can, add some seaweed and stuff to it if you'd like to as well. Depending on the day, I might put in some kombu if I have it, to be able to just give it another flavor profile to that. But definitely look up some Ayurvedic recipes. A great way to be able to start your day using those kind of calming, broth drinks are wonderful to be able to start out with. Great question, Barbara. All right, Freddie, since I'm from another country and may not get all the ingredients, can I change some of the ingredients of the recipes? Thanks in advance. Yes, absolutely, Freddie. We understand that, depending on where you are in the world, you might not be able to get all the ingredients that are used for certain things. So if you're stumped on something, you can always write us and say, what should I use for this? But if you need to change out the ingredients on something, that's totally okay. We love that because you're basically inventing a little bit as you go. And that's part of one of the things we want to teach you through this course is if I am missing something, what can I use to be able to replace it instead? So if you can't find an ingredient, it's absolutely okay to be able to switch it up. Now, if it's something very specific, like say agar, right? We can give you other examples of things to be able to use instead of agar as your thickener. But you just want to write us in advance to make sure that it works properly for you and that you'll also be able to find it. Thanks for that question, Freddie. So Shauna, how do I learn to properly season food so that it is tasty? Is there a base that is used or built on? That's actually from experience, Shauna. So the more you cook, the more you'll actually, this will come second nature to you. And there is no like formula that I know of to say like, okay, this is how you season it to make it tasty. Some people like a lot of salt. Some people like zero salt at all. And that's just one seasoning on something as well too. So the biggest thing to remember here is that you can add, but you can't take away, right? So I would start with a dish that you're really used to making, that you can make easily and well, and then start seasoning it slowly to be able to see exactly what works for you. Now, I do have to say that there's something you have to pay attention to though, because most restaurants will go overboard on salt and fat, right? So at home, I typically don't try to use too much of either of those, depending on the recipe, of course. But in a whole food plant-based diet, you will probably want to limit that back a little bit more too. But you can make something like, we talked about mashed potatoes earlier, right? So make your mashed potatoes and then just add a bit of seasoning to it, stir it all in, and then taste it. And then put a little bit more of your seasoning, stir it all in and taste it. And you can kind of see as it progresses to be able to see about how much you want to put into it. Now, part of this process is also measuring how much you're putting in, right? So if you're putting like a half a teaspoon of something in, use a measuring spoon and see, okay, how much exactly am I putting into this 1 pound of potatoes or something like that. But the biggest thing that I can tell you about this is add a little bit, taste a little bit, add a little bit, taste a little bit. It's one of the reasons that when, I don't know about everybody here, but like my grandma was a great cook, cooked all the time, but when it came for dinner, she never sat down to dinner. And we always asked why. And she's like, I kind of ate while we were going, which is true. Most good chefs are tasting things a lot in the kitchen. And that's part of that. So the more you're actually doing that tasting as you're seasoning it, the more it'll become second nature and you'll know how much seasoning to put in each dish. And that, of course, is different on different dishes at the same time. Hope that helps. Carol, do you have any advice for a student that has little self-confidence in the kitchen? Just absolutely cannot cook worth a hill of beans. That's a great statement. So the biggest thing you can work your self-confidence up in the kitchen is to cook more. It's I get it. Every chef, everybody in this chat has burned something, and that is totally. It's completely a normal thing. So you just need to get in the kitchen and cook often, and be okay to fail. The biggest thing is fail quickly, right? So you can start over quicker and be able to figure out what you did. And don't be, discouraged by it. The more that you're in the kitchen, the more confident you'll feel. I always tell people to work with a base set of recipes. So don't start with an entire cookbook. Start with like one or two recipes out of that cookbook, and then get really good at those recipes and then build upon those recipes. So once you have a base of a recipe, you can start with that and then do that in your repertoire once a week, and then have another recipe you kind of do the same thing with. So experimenting with your cooking in the kitchen is really kind of that great adventure that you can start on, just to revisit it every single day and then build your expertise over time for it. So you will be able to cook an entire hill of beans if you'd like to. All right, so Lisa, do you recommend getting food safe certified? Yeah, in fact, if you are working in a professional kitchen, you need to be food safe certified. That's something typically that there are regulations for food safety, across the country. In the US, I know, and other countries, they have versions of it. But if you can get food safe certified, do it. It's a great thing to be able to do. And it's just one other skill that you can have under your belt. Now, depending on who you're getting certified with, you might need to re-up that certification every year or two, depending on what state you're in as well, too. But good question, Lisa. Laura, is a Sriracha recipe free of xanthan gum or other emulsifiers? Thank you. Yeah, actually it is. The one that's in the Plants Pro class is my recipe and I use red Fresno chilies, about 24 of those, about 2 tablespoons of ginger, just kind of chopped up, and then about 3 cloves of garlic. And then blend that all up and then let it sit in a bowl fermenting for about 7 days, stirring it every day. You'll see those bubbles come out. And then when it's done, I do about half and half white vinegar with it. Maybe not half white vinegar, but a good amount of white vinegar just for texture, to be able to get those too. So it's super simple, and I've been doing it for a long time. It's a great thing to be able to sturdy soup, and used frozen red beans, and questioned if I could refuse for future meals. Yeah, you actually can do that. If you're using a frozen bean or frozen rice, you can totally, make those again, or use those again. You just want to understand that they can start to decompose a little bit, right? So if you're using them and then freezing them, they're going to break down just a little bit. So just keep that in mind. Just keep that in mind because the more that you're freezing and refreezing, that water level is freezing and then expanding, and it's going to start to decompose the outer, the texture of that a little bit. So you just want to pay attention to that. All right, Grace, could you please tell us how to cook black beans and chickpeas until they're nice and soft? I soak them overnight with kombu. That's great, and cook in an Instapot. Especially the black beans come out hard. Thank you. Yeah, black beans and chickpeas are the two that are the hardest to be able to cook evenly. And that's because every single one of those little beans, are different, and they're completely unique to themselves. So I don't actually use an Instapot to cook beans because, especially for black beans and for chickpeas, they cook a little. They always take a little different time, So you can overcook or undercook those beans in an Instapot. And then with an Instapot, like once it's off, you have to completely, restart everything. In a pressure cooker, you have to wait for it to kind of build back up. But if you're just doing it on a pot on a stovetop, you can actually taste as you go along to see like, oh, are these done yet? No, they're not quite done, so I need to be able to let them cook a little bit longer. Something else I just recently found out too is that hard water can affect um, cooking times in beans. So take that in consideration too. Like if you want to use, a water that's not hard, or if you have a water softener at home. We have very hard water here in Austin, and I don't have a water softener, so my beans take ridiculously long to cook sometimes. Some people, say salt or no salt. Salt can actually help to kind of tenderize those up a little bit and stop the bean from kind of exploding out of the skin a little bit too. But you also, I don't like using a ton of salt, so not a technique I use a ton. But so a couple things. One, I would say to switch from the Instapot back to a stovetop for those two beans in particular, because they are so dramatically different on cooking times that you want to be able to keep a close eye onto it and be able to let it go longer if you need it to. Or also pull it if it's cooks shorter, because those beans are so unique, and they're probably the most problematic beans to cook, I'd say. And you don't want them to come out hard. So a couple of things to consider is putting it back onto the tabletop. Or the cooktop. I love that you're using kombu in it. I do that with every batch that beans that I cook. And again, going back to tasting, because it's on the stove top, you'll be able to taste it a lot quicker as well. With those two beans, I never cook them if I'm on a deadline. If I'm like, I have 2 hours until dinner is served, I wouldn't do those right away. I'd cook them a little bit earlier and bring them up to temperature as I need them, just because they're so dramatically different sometimes on the cooking times. You have altitude to bring into that as well too. But hope that helps, Grace. All right, Jeff and Karen, what advice would you share for plant-based meals using a convection microwave oven? I actually don't own a microwave and haven't for a number of years, so I'm not the best expert to talk to about this. But for microwave ovens, I mean, it's a convection microwave oven, so it probably works a little bit like a convection oven where it's moving things around, or the air around in that. I mean, that's great. I would probably use that for kind of quick and easy meals. I would, if I owned a microwave, I'd probably use it mostly just for reheating things. So, but again, I'm not the best expert to be able to ask about the microwave oven. I typically, if I'm going to reheat things, I'll put it into a saute pan or, a soup pot to be able to kind of bring those back up. So, hope that helps a little bit. I'm sorry, I can't give you more information on that one. All right, so Shane, what are the best plant-based cheeses? Even the popular Daisy has ingredients that are not the best. Yeah, plant-based cheeses are interesting, because they're not a whole food plant-based thing, but basically what you're doing is trying to get the same kind of flavor profile you would get out of a cheese into a non-dairy product. Now, they have been trying to do this for a number of years. The ones that I find are the best are the ones that use the same principles that they use in traditional cheese making. So when I worked at Whole Foods Market, I had the pleasure of working with Kathy Strange, who's one of the leading cheese experts in the world, and learned quite a bit about the cheese making process and how it can convert into vegan style. And she specifically worked with Kite Hill very early on to be able to start their fermentation process. Now, since then, there have been a ton of them. I remember when Daya first came out, it tasted kind of plasticky, but now they've had like 5 other kinds of recipes where their product tastes nothing like it did in their first iteration. Miyoko's cheeses are quite good as well, too, to be able to have. But there's not a specific brand that I tell people this is the one you need to do because they vary so differently. There are certain ones that work as a meltable cheese, like a mozzarella on like, a pizza or something like that. But by and large, I'm typically going to make something from home. Like, so if I'm making a pizza, I'll typically use a tofu ricotta. Then I'll make a tofu ricotta at home, just crumble up some soft tofu and then put like like a little bit of garlic and nutritional yeast and maybe some olive oil, mix that all onto it and make that tofu ricotta, basically using that and putting it on the top. But yeah, it's really kind of a personal preference. The artisanal cheeses, I think, are probably the best vegan cheeses I've tried, which are, they're made like a little brie wheel or something like that. They're made out of like almonds or whatever they pick. And they're specifically kind of going after that really small micro, niche market. There's a place here in Austin, Texas called Rebel Cheese that is fantastic, and they're a purveyor. They're cheesemongers, but for vegan cheese. But that's just here in Austin, Texas. They're nowhere else in the country. But there are vegan cheesemongers popping up all over the world. So doing a little bit of research on those, you can find different vegan cheesemongers or websites would help point you to different vegan cheeses that will get the effect and flavor you're looking for because they are so diverse. If you're looking for like a chef style, like just something that's spreadable on a cracker, Mayoko's is wonderful for that as well too. But if you're looking for a sliced cheese, like I've found like the Chow brands or like like my girls love the smoked Gouda cheddars, or the smoked Gouda slices. I think from Chow makes those. Maybe it's 365 brand is the one that they get at those, but and I think it's Follow Your Heart is the one we use for multiple mozzarella for like pizza nights and stuff like that. So part of this is experimentation and seeing what works. And because they change the recipes so often, it might not always work. So, kind of experimentation with that. So I hope that helps, Shane. Cherry, I'm in search of a software that I can load a menu into and get nutritional information outputted. Can you recommend one? I actually can't. I know that there are systems out there that do that. When I worked at Whole Foods, we had a whole crew of nutritionists doing that. But I don't know of one off the top of my head that could be used for an individual, only in really large commercial settings. You might want to reach out to a registered dietitian to see if they have some advice on that. I know that Adante on our team might be able to help you with that. He's a registered dietitian. He's actually at a live event tomorrow, but on a completely different subject. So you might want to ask him, and you can just reach out to him at Adante at Ruby. And that's ADANTE at ruby.com. Despina, when onions and peppers are sauteed in a hot nonstick pan, when should the minced garlic be added? Should water be added with the garlic? Yeah, you're right to add the garlic later. So when I'm cooking onions and peppers, together and sauteing them, I'm going to wait to put the garlic in because the onions and peppers are going to cook. They're going to take longer to cook than the garlic. The garlic cooks really, really fast to be able to make that happen. Now, depending on what you're cooking it with, you don't need to add any water to it. You can just add the garlic directly into the pan and mix it around. Now, if you're adding other stuff to that, you might want to add the garlic a little bit later. If I'm not sure why you would add the water to it unless you also want to steam saute some of the things, which you totally could do, but it's not something you have to do. So yeah, definitely wait to put the garlic in when you're doing those other ones to be able to get the caramelization on the onions and peppers, and then you can add the garlic afterward. We actually have a recipe for mushroom alambre tacos in the new plant-based pro too that uses that same technique. All right, Beth, my plates are off-white and the course states I need plain white plates. Do I need something specific or can I get something rather inexpensive? Your plates being off-white is totally fine. We do state that we want you to have plain white plates, but we have a little bit of a caveat on that, right? So the reason that we state that is because we don't want your plates distracting from the food. A lot of times we'll see plates with lots of different unique designs on them and things, and that's just kind of taking away from the dish. We want to be able to see your dish and the way you're presenting it without any distractions on it. So your off-white plates are totally fine. If you have off-white plates to be able to plate on, that's wonderful. Just remember, like if you're, the reason we do white is because a lot of the foods we're looking for have a lot of color in them too. So it can pop off the plate a little bit more. So try to stay with a white-ish type plate. The off-white is totally fine though. Just try to keep free of, different patterns on plates or different designs on plate that might distract from the food that's on those as well. If you're using colored plates, just make sure that the color of the food that you're actually putting on the plate is a different color, right? So if you're putting a bunch of greens onto a green plate, it can get lost really, really easy. So that's why we ask that people use those white plates. So if you have them, great. Off-white, totally fine to be able to use as well. If you are looking at this and you are one of those people that doesn't have a white or off plates, something like that, you can always just email us at support to be able to see if your plates will work. And I'm pretty sure they will. We can work around with that a little bit. So Lisa, Can you simmer stock all day long? Any advantage to developing flavor or not? You can simmer stock all day if you'd like. I have inadvertently done it for like 3 or 4 hours a couple times, just because I forgot that it was on there. But basically, what you're doing is you're reducing the flavor down into it. So, I will typically put in a bunch of my stock ingredients and then just cover it with water, and then bring it to a boil and down to a simmer for about an hour and a half. And then that hour and a half mark, I've pretty much gotten all the nutrients and the flavor I've got on what to get out of there. So if I were to go longer, like an all day thing, what's going to happen is that water is going to start evaporating down, and it's going to start concentrating the flavor into the stock more. So you can do that. I would probably take all the other vegetables out of it after a certain point because they'll start to peak over the top of the water line or the stock line. Um, but you definitely could do that. What you're basically doing is reducing it for a bigger flavor at that point, though, too. Is there an advantage to it? That's probably the only development that I can think of that is just, developing a stronger, more rich flavor from the broth that's already existing. Mary, regarding the dried mushrooms, how do you stop the broth from turning dark with mushroom juices? That's actually one of the things that actually does happen with the dried mushrooms. Now, depending on the mushroom that you're using, you could use something like a dried porcini mushroom, which is more like a white mushroom, or you could use dried white mushrooms to be able to make it. Lion's mane is also kind of a lighter, as well too, but a little more expensive. So depending on the type of dried mushroom that you're using, will make it so you have a lighter stock on those two. Like if you were doing things like I use the shiitake stems all the time, it doesn't actually turn my broth too brown at all. But typically my broths are pretty dark because I do like the mushroom in them as well too. So, but just using a lighter color in the mushroom, and then to not get it brown, avoiding some of the other colors in there too. But that's probably what I do. Just pick a lighter mushroom. Lisa, what happened to your rooted teas? I'd love to buy one. That's funny. I haven't thought of that in a while. So you must be on my website on danmerrick.com. Rooted Teas is a wonderful business that once I had kids, I kind of ran out of time to do, but it will come back at some point. They were fun t-shirts that were all vegetable themed, so you'd see things like the Adidas logo, but it actually said Pepitas, on it, or it said Veg Out, but in the Run DMC type of logo. Fun things, fun t-shirts. I'm sure we'll get those up going again soon, but we haven't done them recently. But thanks for bringing that back up, Lisa. Katie, what does alcohol add to food? If you don't want to use alcohol at all, what do you recommend as a substitute? Cashew, bechamel, or penne carbonara? I think this is the same question we had earlier. So the alcohol, you're basically looking for the flavor profile of it and probably a bit of acidity to be able to add it, which is adding a depth to the flavor of food. So if you don't want to use the alcohol, you can just not use it at all, but you can also use a juice of some sort, typically like a white grape juice. Definitely don't go for like a Concord, Welch's grape juice. Try to look for a very subtle grape juice on those as well. And the cashew bechamel or penne carbonara, you definitely don't need the wines in those or alcohol. And those are two kind of similar-ish dishes, but also very different. In the vegan world, they're more similar. In the actual, Italian world, they're different. The cashew bechamel or the bechamel is typically milk and flour, and you make it into a roux and build the sauce up of that. With cashew bechamel, you're doing the same thing, but you're using the cashews as the fat. And penne carbonara, it's basically like an egg and cheese kind of mix for carbonara, but in the vegan world, we're going to be a little closer to a bechamel as your coating, but then adding other unique flavor profiles like a smoked anything basically to it. I usually use a shiitake mushroom. I'm using smoked salts and things like that. Julietta, do you have a gluten-free flour recipe you would recommend since chickpeas? Please do not say Bob's Red Mill. I buy in bulk to avoid plastic packaging, so I stopped buying their products a while back. That was probably going to be my go-to as a gluten-free flour recipe. The other thing is, like, I also buy in bulk from places. I usually try to find locally a really good local flour support. And I'll usually go for ancient grain flours. I don't go gluten-free myself, but I do probably half the time I'm cooking as I do gluten-free. But what I do is I'll find a grain producer that does ancient grains. I have a couple here in Texas that I love, that I look to, and those are probably my big kind of go-tos. I was looking for, somebody who does an ancient grain and then can grind them into the flour that I want. And I typically go with a 00 flour on those. What I find with that is that a lot of people that have gluten intolerances are actually okay with them, which is surprising. And of course, I never serve them to them and say this is gluten-free. I always tell them that this is an ancient grain. You can try it at your own risk. But most of those people have said that they've had no problems with them. As far as gluten-free and bulk, I don't know what to tell you on that one, because Bob's Red Mill has been my go-to for gluten-free flours for a while, just because for so long they were the only people that supported the gluten-free, community, and I was able to get it. So even going to like Whole Foods and stuff like that now, it's kind of hard to find chickpea flour. You'll find all kinds of other ones, but Bob's was nice because you're able to find it, it was consistent, and that they're truly done in a gluten-free facility. But if you're looking for bulk gluten-free flours, I would recommend looking for some local sources to be able to buy in bulk. In the same way, Bob's Red Mill also does large quantity. They sell it for restaurant styles too, which you can do as well. But I'm sorry I can't be more help on that one, Julietta. Diane, how do you know which plant-based dishes go with others when putting together a meal? That's just experience. Tasting them next to each other is probably the biggest thing to do. So when you are making a menu, you want to kind of keep those things in mind. It's literally tasting them next to each other, because that's really the only way you can get that is by experience and knowing what kind of the flavor profiles are. Now, of course, I could go through like a menu and see what all the ingredients are and kind of get like okay, that should kind of go together. But depending on what sauces or vinaigrettes or whatever they're putting on things and what the ingredients on there in those, it's impossible to tell without seeing like a full-on recipe. So experimentation and tasting are probably the best way to get to those. Zena, can you recommend a couple plant-based dinner ideas for picky eaters who prefer animal products? Yeah, depending on how old your picky eater is, they're probably one of my go-tos recently has been pressed mushrooms. So you can see this, actually, Chad Sardo, who helped develop the plant-based pro course. His brother Derek is like the master of the pressed mushroom and having it very meaty flavored too. So what he'll do is take oyster mushrooms and season them. So season them with like garlic powder, onion powder, paprika, different things like that. And then put them into a pan. Typically he'll use put one pan on the bottom and then take the second pan and put it on the top and then weigh down the top pan. So it presses this mushroom, either using maitake or oyster mushrooms, and it basically makes it into this kind of thick patty and really browns the outside. And it's almost like a steak-like consistency. That you can go with a bunch of different flavor profiles and different seasonings to be able to make happen. That's a great one. Or also taking the same oyster mushrooms and kind of shredding them apart with your fingers or your hands. You can also do the same thing with different kinds of mushrooms like the trumpets or the king trumpet mushrooms. In our meat alternatives class or meat alternatives section of the Plant-Based Pro, we go through a bunch of these on shredded mushrooms, on jackfruits, on all kinds of different things to be able to use as meat substitutes. And those are probably good places to be able to start for people who's really looking to be able to serve to somebody who's used to having animal products and are pickier eaters. Now, that being said, plant-based whole food diet might be too much of a jump for this picky eater, and that's one of the reasons that they've come out with brands like the Impossible Burgers and things like that, which are not whole food plant-based. But if you're serving to somebody who's just making that transition, that's exactly what those foods are for. I've talked to the owners of the Impossible and all those other brands, and they cater specifically for people that are making that transition. That's why I actually can't eat an Impossible Burger, because it tastes too much like meat to me, and it brings back something, and I'm just like, nope, that's just not what I like. I get a veggie burger that tastes like veggies instead. So some of those products actually work really well for those, and they have a wide variety of either burgers or hot dogs or all kinds of things to be able to make those happen. But for plant-based, versions, I'd probably say going for different things like the pressed mushrooms or the jackfruits or the shredded mushrooms. So I hope that helps. Darren, what do you consider the difference between plant-based cooking and whole food plant-based cooking? It's actually a very simple thing. The whole food plant-based cooking is looking at whole ingredients, so unprocessed foods. That means no oils because they're so processed. Like think about it, like what does an olive look like, before you make it into oil, and what's the final product? They don't look anything alike, right? So the people that are going through things like the Forks Over Knives courses are going very unprocessed. Where plant-based cooking, it can be processed. So you'll see things like the Impossible Burger or the Unbeatable Burgers, or all those other ones that very processed kinds of food, where the whole food plant-based cooking is not going to be very processed at all, not using a lot of those ingredients. So it's kind of a quick overview as an explanation for that. Let's see, I'm a medical provider. I'm very much interested in finding handouts and easy, cheap recipes for patients with certain health concerns. Additionally, would like to develop a group class, possibly reimbursable for these patients. That's actually great. We are working on something that's kind of along that line for class-wise. That will be probably a little bit further out in the year. But as far as handouts go, the handouts, for easy, cheap recipes kind of depends on the issue that they're having, right? So if they're diabetic, you might want to go to the American Diabetic Association. If they have cardiovascular problems, they might want to go to the American Cardiovascular. These are places that are probably the best place to find a handout. Ruby doesn't really do like a printable handout kind of recipe thing, so those organizations would help. But you'd also have to realize like it's interesting because they have certain partnerships, right? The National Cardiovascular Center, I think, is sponsored by the meat industry, and so a lot of their recipes have meat in them. Or we know from plant-based diets that cardiovascular disease is one of the biggest contributions is eating a high processed meat diet. So kind of looking through what some of these options are from different places and picking them out for your knowledge might help with that a little bit too. But in the future, we'll probably have something. I'm not sure about handouts as far as that goes. But in the meantime, a lot of the organizations that deal specifically with these issues will have those kinds of printouts for them. You'll have to kind of go through them a little bit piece by piece. Hope that helps a little bit. Jeff and Karen, for those of us with CKD, what methods can reduce potassium in potatoes prior to cooking? So if you do have CKD, potatoes are pretty high in potassium, so you want to eat them pretty limitedly. So like that being said, if you want to take some of the potassium out of them, soaking them is probably your best bet. So cutting them thin, or you could do like a hash brown, kind of style in those, and then soaking them in water because it'll help take some of the potassium out. Now, again, I can't really tell you how much of it's going to take out, but it does do it, a good amount of it. But depending on your level of CKD, that's, I don't want to go too far down that road because I'm a chef, I'm not a doctor, right? But if you're trying to lower potassium in potatoes, just specifically do that. Soaking them in water for a couple hours will probably help to do that. The thinner slice, the better, because you'll get more of the surface area to be able to help get that potassium out of those potatoes. Susan, I'm interested in starting teaching home vegan cooking classes. Great. Don't know if what the question is there, but that's wonderful. Just if you're doing it, there are some things to keep in mind, and I don't know. There's a lot of different things to keep in mind for starting a home vegan cooking classes. But just have fun with it. Your knowledge base from Ruby, it's a great place to start. So that's a wonderful adventure, and it'll be great. So good job, Susan. Dennis, I'm presently taking a Forks Over Knives whole food plant-based course and loving it. When I research Ruby recipes, though, I'm on the main page, I find that even the vegan recipes indicate adding oil. Wouldn't that conflict with whole food plant-based? Yeah, so those whole food plant-based diet is not, and vegan are not the same thing. Whole food plant-based diet is a much stricter version of a vegan diet. So you can be vegan and eat Oreos and plant-based hot dogs and Impossible burgers and Doritos, and you can still be a vegan, but that doesn't mean that you're whole food plant-based. So there is a sorting thing on our page, but to be able to do no oil, but I don't think there's a ton of them on there. As far as sorting goes, we do have a lot of recipes that are no oil though, and majority of them, like 99% of them, can be done with no oil. It's been my expertise for years is converting dishes into recipes that don't use oil. So if you're having a problem with one in particular one, you can always just email me at that, Dennis. So, but yeah, for the classes that you're going to see in the rest of Ruby, it's not 100% vegan platform either. So you'll see different classes that have meats in them too. So if you're looking for the specific whole food plant-based recipes, you'll find them in the Forks Over Knives course. If you're looking for more of them, you can also go to the Forks Over Knives website, which has an amazing array of different whole food plant-based recipes that you can experiment. And they're really great in the interactive department there too. So really kind of looking at those and diversifying your recipes would be great as well. But yeah, so vegan doesn't mean whole food plant-based. It basically means plant-based. The whole food part that's kind of the difference I talked about earlier is, not having any processed ingredients in it at all. Diane, my birthday's coming up and I was in a store lately that sells carbon steel pans. I have one for cooking crepes and have it to use pancakes. I was wondering about the usefulness of buying one that's more skillet size. Any thoughts? That's great. I mean, carbon steel pans are wonderful. They're great for putting a sear on things. They heat up really, really super fast. I was over at my mom's this weekend making breakfast tacos, and I use a different pan here, and that one just heated up super duper fast. I was surprised at how fast it heated up. It's great because it's also light at the same time too. But quite honestly, it really depends on your personal preference. Like the one that I use for my tortillas is like the Lodge style pan, and that actually works wonderful for doing those kinds of things. Now I have, skillets versions of those as well too, and use those. But by and large, I'm actually using a stainless steel pan or a non-stick pan, primarily, depending on what you want for it. But the carbon steel, they're nice because they heat up really quickly. They're pretty light compared to like a Lodge style pan. But they also create sears on things pretty quick, and they're oven safe. You can just throw the whole pan right in the oven typically too. But if that's what you like and using that's great. As far as particular brands and pans, I never go into those because I think each one's just a little bit unique on those two. Arlene, what's a good wash to use on fruits and veggies? I use just water. If I know it's something that has a pesticide or something on it, I might put a little bit of vinegar into like a whole tub of water to be able to get that off, just to make sure the vinegar doesn't transfer the flavor to the food. But sometimes those high pesticide foods need that. But typically I'm just going to use water to be able to do those on. Doris, what are the requirements to start a dessert business to sell to chain stores? Wow, that's a whole class in itself. The requirements, there's a lot, there's too many to list right now. There's a whole set of requirements you need to be able to go through, from licenses to permits, testers. You'll need a facility to be able to make those. Consistency. That's a pretty big question for this, and you might want to talk to a consultant on somebody who's done that before to be able to go further into that. It's a fun business, but there's a lot of things that are involved in it. A lot of business stuff and not as much fun stuff in the kitchen too. So I hope that helps a little bit. Rodney, I have not used the Convection Bake on our oven. What suggestions or recommendations do you have? So Convection Bake is a great thing to use, and I use it a lot, but it's basically what it's doing. It's circulating air through your oven using a fan. So it's going to cook a little more consistently. It's good for roasts as well, like if you're roasting vegetables in there too. But like I wouldn't use it like on a cake, but I use it for most of my other things that I do, like roasting, or if I'm doing like a seitan or something like that in there too, I'll use the convection oven just because it's the air circulating makes it a more even bake that's in your oven as well. That's probably a good start for you. Sarah, let's see. I'm working on a whole food plant-based frozen pizza business and wanted to see if you have any tips, suggestions, or guidelines for baking pizza crust specifically with spelt flour. I often struggle with over kneading my dough. Yep, I was just thinking that as you're doing it. Peter Reinfeld is probably one of the best pizza crusts that I've known that does a whole food plant-based crust. And we worked with him at Whole Foods to be able to do it, and we did this whole food plant-based, and he probably came the closest to it that I've seen that was like just spot on for tasting what you're looking for. So I would probably check out, he has a couple different cookbooks, and I think he actually did a pizza crust book too. So probably check that out to be able to see where I'm going. Yeah, so, and the pizza crust that I typically make, I'm again using that kind of local sourced ancient grain, flour to be able to do with that. But if you're using spelt flour, that's going to be a little bit different for those two. So check out Peter Reinhardt and some of his cookbooks. So Tammy, would you recommend the cutting board from Epicurean? I'm not sure what cutting board that is, so I can't recommend it either way because I'm not sure what you're talking about. All right, so Yvonne, Jazz. Hi, Dan Merrick. Thank you for this Q&A. I'm new at all of this, and the Q&A are helping me get acquainted with the journey I'm embarking on. I just want to live a healthy and learn to cook healthy. No question as of yet. Well, welcome to Ruby, Yvonne. It's a wonderful community. If you are on Facebook, definitely join the Facebook group that you are affiliated with, because it's a lot of help from all the people that work with you when we do these live events quite regularly. All right, so Babs, how do you properly wash fruits and veggies? I'm going to use them in water specifically for harder vegetables. I'm going to wipe the outside of them. For a colander, things like the, broccolis and berries and stuff like that, we'll probably use for those too. Karen, hi Chef Dan, how long do you typically keep your dried herbs, paprika, oregano, blah, blah, blah? And yep, I've had them in my cabinet for a year. That's exactly what I was going to say. So Karen, some of these have, what I do is every time I get an herb, I write on the bottom of them with a Sharpie marker and just write, here's the date that I got them. So I know exactly the year from that, that I'm going to replace them. That was a dead on question, and you're totally right on those. So all of those, I keep at 1 year maximum. Otherwise, they're just going to start using their potency, and then you have to use too much of it in something. So don't overbuy your herbs at the same time too. So let's see, Jose Antonio, do you prefer Sentoku or a chef's knife for a plant-based lifestyle? What sizes do you recommend? I don't use a Sentoku. I've used them in the past, and I own a couple, but I typically use I think it's a 8-inch chef knife. It's typically my go-to. I have probably 3 of them in my knife block just so I can grab them. My wife can use them as we need them as well too. But it doesn't really matter which one you use for a plant-based lifestyle. Whatever feels comfortable in your hand. That's the most important thing, is it feels comfortable in your hand and it's really, really sharp. Those are the best kinds of knives you can get. So whatever feels best to you, try it out. And here's another one from Jose. Is smart ridge and or hollow edge tech in knives useful, or is cutting technique skill better? I'm not sure what the other ones of smart ridge. Oh, and hollow edge. Yeah, so those are okay. Those are great. They basically just help things fall off your knife when you're cutting them. But cutting skill, totally the best way to go. Just getting used to it, getting your hands in the right places, is the best way to be able to work for that. All right, so that's our last question. Thanks, Jose. And thank you everybody for joining us today. This has been our office hours with Dan Merrick. Thank you for joining us. And if you have more questions, we'll be on soon. You can also email me at dan@ruby.com. Have a wonderful day.